broadband internet example? All right, perfect. So obviously, having access to internet is good for consumers. So much of our entertainment comes from the internet. We get a ton of information from there nowadays. But the question of how beneficial is it really to people? Overall, like how much better off is society? So in order to try to estimate that, we can actually try to get the consumer surplus. And we can do that if we had the demand curve for internet service and the price of internet service. Obviously, trying to estimate a demand curve is going to be very difficult in the real world, but some economists tried this. So back in 2006, the average price for internet service was $36 a month. So they estimated a demand curve where across the y-axis here, it's $73.89. That's where 0 consumers would purchase. And there ended up being 47 million subscribers per month. So then, once they estimated this demand curve, they tried to find the consumer surplus, which is just the area of the triangle between the price and the demand curve. So the area of the triangle is a half times the base times the height. So it's a 1/2 times 47 million, which is the number of subscribers each month, times the price, which is the height. So $79.89 minus 36. This length of the triangle there. So each month, there was a consumer surplus of $890.4 million per month from internet access in 2006. So that's how much consumers valued the internet above what they had to pay for it. Now for this last consumer here, consumer number 47 million, they valued it exactly at $36. So they're trading $36 and getting back something they valued $36 from. So they have no consumer surplus. Every single other consumer on there is getting some sort of benefit in excess of what they're paying for. So this was their estimation at the time of the total benefit, total consumer surplus from having internet access. We didn't talk about elasticity in this class, so I'll give a brief explanation. This isn't something you're going to be tested on, but something you'll work with in Econ 102 for like the business majors that would continue with this. And it's something it does help to understand. The basic idea of elasticity is consumer and producer sensitivity to changes in price. So if you imagine gasoline, people's demand for gasoline doesn't change too much with price changes. You still need to get to work, you still need to get to school, you still need to go out and run however many errands. Now you may not take a long drive that weekend. You may do a bunch of your errands on the same day, so you're running out less. So you'll decrease. So the price of gas increases, you may decrease your driving a little bit. But all in all, you're still fairly not sensitive to price. Whereas other goods, maybe it's a necessity, so you have to buy it. Maybe there's not a lot of other goods that can do the same thing. So for gasoline, not a lot of other options you can use. Not a lot of other substitutes that can take the place of gasoline. For some goods, they're not a necessity. Maybe they're luxuries. Maybe there's a lot of other things that could fulfill those needs for you. So people are a lot more sensitive to price for those goods. So there's a small price change, there'll be a large change in the quantity demanded. And what this does is, when we're drawing supply and demand curves, like before, our supply curve is like that, it's like a 45-degree angle. If the demand for a good is elastic, if it's very sensitive to price, it'll be flat like this. So if there's a small price change, so if you move here from P1 to P2, So small increase in price, we'll see a much larger increase in the quantity demanded. Alternatively, if it's inelastic, so it doesn't respond to price, we'll see like a much steeper curve. So it'll be larger increase here, a smaller increase in the quantity demanded. So the basic idea is for elastic goods, people are more sensitive to price. For inelastic goods, they're not very sensitive to price.
You said you're not going to affect this on the
No, I'm not. But this does come into play with the idea of consumer producer surplus. I think it's worth touching on. Again, for most of you, this will be your only econ class. So there are a few topics throughout the year I'm going to hit just very lightly. Not that you will be tested on because it's not something you need to know, but it's something that would end up being beneficial for you to at least heard of. Okay, so we'll compare two products from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, Fight Milk and Wolf Cola. So let's say Fight Milk has a small fan base that's very sensitive to price because there's a lot of other products they could use. A lot of other different supplements that can meet those needs that Fight Milk has. On the other hand, there's Wolf Cola. It has a very distinctive taste. It's sold in many markets, and it's one of the few options available, so there's not a lot of substitutes. So it ends up with a much less elastic demand. Consumers are a lot less sensitive to price for Wolf Cola. So what we see here is Fight Milk. Consumers are more sensitive to price, so the demand curve is going to be a lot less steep, so more shallow. And they're going to have a smaller consumer surplus. Because consumers are sensitive to price, you're not going to have a lot of consumers that value it super high. So you end up with a very low consumer surplus. Whereas when consumers are not sensitive to price, there's going to be a lot of consumers willing to pay a lot for it, so you end up with a much higher consumer surplus. So if you're a firm and there's a good that you know people aren't very sensitive to price for, there's not a lot of competitors or other goods that they could buy. Maybe it's a necessity, so again, they're going to buy it pretty much no matter what. In that case, there's going to be a much higher consumer surplus. Whereas when there's a lot of competitors or a lot of different products you can use, maybe it's not a necessity, it's just a luxury, something people tend to like, there's going to be a much lower consumer surplus. So that's basically what I just said. All right. That brings us to the end of consumer surplus. Do you guys have any questions from last time, from the previous class? Or the ending today? Okay. So now producer surplus, kind of like when we looked at supply and demand. We went in depth on demand, and this is supply is pretty similar. In this case, producer surplus is pretty similar to consumer surplus. So producer surplus is the difference between the lowest price a firm would accept for a good or service and the price it actually receives. So this lowest price a firm is willing to accept for a good or service is the marginal cost of producing that unit. Obviously, firms don't want to produce at a loss. They don't want to earn a loss because, you have a budget constraint, you have to stay in business. So as long as they can make a profit, break even or make a profit on that good, they'll be willing to produce it and sell it. So anything they make above that cost is going to be your producer surplus. So going back to the KIT market, there's a very small producer here of KIT, and they're deciding to make between 0 and 4 cups. So here's your supply curve. Again, it's like a set of steps because there's only 4 units here. The first unit costs them $1.25 to make. The second one $1.50 to make. The third $1.75. And the fourth unit $2.25. So in this case, let's say they're selling the cup of tea at $2. their producer surplus is going to be the difference between the marginal cost of each unit and the price they're selling at. So for that first unit, they're making $2 and they're selling it for $1.25. Sorry, they're selling it for $2. It costs them $1.25 to make. That difference, that 75 cents, is going to be their producer surplus. So like the profit that they're making on that first unit. So then for the second unit, the marginal cost of producing that is $1.50. So the $2 price minus the $1.50 marginal cost is 50 cents. So on that second unit they produce, their producer surplus will be 50 cents. And the difference between the marginal cost of the third unit and the price is 25 cents. So in that third unit, they have 25 cents of producer surplus. And the fourth unit being $2.25, so that's above the price. Because it's more expensive to produce the good than the price that they'll get back for it, they won't produce that fourth unit. Because it'll be too costly for them. But with those 3 units they're producing, their total producer surplus is the sum of all 3 of those, so A, B, and C. What, 75 cents, 50 cents, and 25 cents. So their producer surplus is $1.50. Or the profit that they're making is $1.50. So just like for when we looked at that very simple example for consumer surplus, where we just had 4 consumers, and we said that that weird shaped demand curve isn't going to hold for like a normal market. Normal market is going to be that straight line like we deal with. Same thing with producer surplus. So for the entire market for KIT, and I think this is for the whole United States, you end up with your normal shaped supply curve. So in this situation, the producer surplus is going to be the difference between the price, so straight line there at the price, and the supply curve. So that area in between the two. So again, it's important to note this. A lot of times students will mistakenly label this the producer surplus. What's the difference between the price and the supply curve? And then the consumer surplus would be up here. Say the demand curve goes through there. That would be the consumer surplus. So they're right next to each other. Okay, so consumer surplus measures the net benefit to consumers from participating in the market. It's not the total benefit. So remember, consumer surplus is equal to the total benefit received by consumers minus the total amount they have to pay for the good or service. That's why it's above the price that they're paying. So it's not all the benefit that they're getting, it's the benefit after you take into account how much they have to pay for it. So likewise, producer surplus measures the net benefit received by producers for participating in the market. It's the net benefit, so it's going to account for the cost of producing those goods. So producer surplus is equal to the total amount firms receive from consumers minus the cost of producing the good. So that's why it's the difference between the price and the supply curve. All right, so this brings us to the next section, the efficiency of competitive markets. So we talked before how competitive markets result in the most efficient outcomes. So these competitive markets are characterized by many buyers and many sellers. So there's a lot of competitive pressure on sellers to bring both quality products to the market to meet consumer needs and to do so at a low price. And neither buyers nor sellers have like pricing power in the market because of the number of each of them. There's not a lot of government intervention into the market to move us out of equilibrium. But at the same time, the government provides protection for like property rights a strong, robust legal system, sort of setting the rules of the game. We can think of efficiency in the market in two different ways. The first is thinking about marginal benefits and marginal cost. So definition of an efficient market this way is market is efficient if all trades take place where the marginal benefit exceeds the marginal cost. And once you reach there, no other trades take place. The other way to think about it is that we think about producer and consumer surplus. So market is efficient if it maximizes the sum of consumer surplus and the sum of producer surplus. So both consumers and producers are made as well off as possible. So this total net benefit, so the sum of producer surplus and consumer surplus, the two sides of the market, is known as economic surplus. The economic surplus is just the total amount of surplus created by engaging in market transactions. Okay, so let's look at each of these in turn. So first, looking at marginal benefit equaling marginal cost. So we have the demand curve, which represents the marginal benefit, and the supply curve, which represents the marginal cost of each transaction. Right now in this market, we have an equilibrium quantity, 15,000 units. And at that point, the price was $2 per cup. Well, let's say firms don't realize this for some reason, and they only end up producing 14,000 units. So what's going to happen here? Well, the marginal cost of 14,000 units is only $1.80. The marginal benefit here for consumers is $2.20. The price they're being charged is $2.20. So firms, they want to make money, right? They're going to realize, hey, it only costed $1.80 to produce something that can sell for more than that. So they're going to increase their production. They're going to keep increasing their production as long as marginal benefits greater than marginal cost. They'll move up the supply curve all the way up here, 15,000 units. Once they reach that point, the marginal benefit to consumers is going to decrease from $2.20 that we see at like the 14,000 units down to $2. Whereas the marginal cost to firms at 15,000 units is going to be $2. So at that point, there's no more incentive for firms to produce more. At that point, they'll begin losing money. So they're not going to want to do that very long. So we see, the invisible hand working. We have these incentives for firms to keep producing more because they can have a greater marginal benefit than marginal cost. On the other hand, if the quantity is too high, let's say they produce 16,000 units instead. The marginal cost here, $2.20. The marginal benefit to consumers is only $1.80. So we have production that's inefficiently high. The marginal cost of producing that last unit, $2.20, is 40 cents more than they can get back from consumers. And consumers will be willing to pay at that point. So at that point, the firm will either be forced to sell at a loss and decrease their production later. If it's not something like tea, something that you can actually store, firms can just hold on to inventories and reduce their production the next period and just wait, slowly bring those out from inventories and sell at that equilibrium price. So firms will not, for very long, especially once they realize the mistake, keep producing where the marginal benefit is lower than the marginal cost in this case. So if they make a mistake, if firms make a mistake and they're on either side of equilibrium quantity, they'll get pushed towards equilibrium.
Is the reason why the price increases and the units increase because of labor costs and stuff like that? Because I would have thought the price would decrease with more units.
Yeah, so it's basically there's labor costs that go into that, and there's just the cost of buying resources. The more raw materials you get, you're gonna have to pay more and more to get them from other uses.
Okay.
There is an idea called economies of scale that I think we'll talk about later. That is firms increase their production, they can lower their per unit cost. And that works for a while, based on like how productive the technology is, and people are able to specialize at like one specific task. But in general, these firms are like already producing, like they've reached economies of scale. So it's increasing their production above that. Okay, but we can also think of this competitive equilibrium as maximizing producer and consumer surplus. So we look here, consumer surplus, the difference between the demand curve, the marginal benefit to consumers, and the price they pay. So this triangle right here. And producer surplus, the difference between the price and the marginal cost of production. The lowest price that firms are willing to accept. There's your producer surplus. When a market is at the competitive equilibrium, both the consumer and the producer surplus are maximized. That's the greatest that they'll be. So this, our two different concepts of economic efficiency result in the same level of output. Whether we're thinking about this as marginal cost and marginal benefits, or if we're talking about economic efficiency from producer and consumer surplus.
Is the producer surplus equal to the consumer surplus? Or is it just in this picture?
Just in that picture.
Okay.
Yeah, they are equal to each other in this picture. But typically there's, your supply and your demand curve will be at least slightly different like angles.
Okay.
Okay, so let's look at when the market is not in equilibrium. See what's going to occur. So at a price of $2, so when we're at equilibrium, A, B, and C are, all three of those are the consumer surplus. And D and E right here are the producer surplus. Now let's say instead of producing the 15,000 units, firms instead for some reason produce 14,000 units. So they're producing right here, and they're selling $2.20 to consumers. So what's going to happen? Because producer surplus is the difference between the price and the marginal cost of the supply curve, since it's now being sold $2.20, rectangle B, which used to be part of the consumer surplus, is now becomes part of the producer surplus. So the producer surplus is D and B. So from the price it's being sold at down to the supply curve. So not only do consumers lose this rectangle B, they also lose C. And then producers lose E. So these are the 1,000 transactions that would have taken place in equilibrium that don't take place. C and E are known as deadweight loss because while B, this area, goes from consumer surplus to producer surplus, so someone still captures that benefit. It's just changing parties. For C and E, those transactions are no longer taking place. Because they're not taking place, that's lost to everyone. So no one in society gets the benefit of those transactions that they would get the benefit from if the market was in equilibrium. So deadweight loss can be thought of as the amount of inefficiency in a market. Because these are transactions that we had the proper level of production and the right price that is the equilibrium in the market, these would take place and someone would get these benefits. So in a competitive equilibrium, the deadweight loss is 0. So right there, you notice there's no deadweight loss area. But here, when we're producing at 14,000 units, we're selling at this higher price. So we move from equilibrium here to up here, we end up with this deadweight loss. All right. Sorry, this one slide got put out of order. So because our two ideas of economic efficiency coincide, they both suggest we're going to have this competitive market equilibrium as like the optimal scenario. We can give the official definition. So economic efficiency is is a market outcome in which the marginal benefit to consumers of the last unit produced is equal to the marginal cost to producers of that last unit being produced. And the sum of consumer surplus and producer surplus is at a maximum. So this definition of economic efficiency highlights the two things that are going on in competitive equilibrium. The marginal benefit, marginal cost being equal, showing that there's the incentives that moves the market towards equilibrium. That when you're not in equilibrium, the incentives created by marginal benefit and marginal cost. So if the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost, production is too low, that's going to encourage firms to produce more and bring us up towards equilibrium. There's also producer surplus and consumer surplus. So this idea shows us how competitive markets, voluntary exchange, how these make people better off than how they are without trade. So it's these two ideas going on at the same time, which is why we have this long definition. All right, do you guys have any questions about this section?
So with producer surplus,
This one?
yeah. So is it always going to be just below the consumer surplus triangle on the graph? Or-
So you mean always below this A?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then if they're stuck to the right, up under that, that's the dead split box.
Yeah, so if we're producing at these 14,000 units, or anything less than equilibrium, so the numbers sold, quantity sold is gonna be like up here on this demand curve. So because we're selling here, these units aren't being sold, that's why they're dead weight loss. Because those are things that are not happening, that would happen in equilibrium. And then A, the consumer surplus is gonna be the difference between the price they're selling at and the demand curve. So in this case, because it's that higher price, it's now this smaller area. Sort of just from the way we draw this, like we put this dotted line here at the new price it's being sold at.
Yeah.
So that A will be however big the triangle is above that. You can imagine if it was $2.10, the price would be here.
Yeah.
That would still be labeled A, or just be slightly bigger the triangle.
Is that also a shortage then, since the consumers aren't getting as much?
Exactly. So in this case, there's a shortage of 1,000 units compared to what consumers would want. Okay, let's take a break. It's been a while. Anyone know the update for TikTok? I saw a couple snarky tweets about it over the weekend, but I wasn't sure what the official news was.
I know, I'm pretty sure the giant company is letting the American company get it there. So that is like, now we can have China and America.
Yeah, our government spies on us enough already. What's one more, right? My hope is they just get enough data on everyone that they can't pick on me, because there's just too much data to sift through. Right? Because they track everything you do.
Yeah.
You ever talk about like a random product and then suddenly you have like 40 ads for it on Facebook?
Oh, okay. So Oracle and Walmart are buying 20% of it, and the original makers are keeping 80%.
So that's all it takes is 20% US ownership, apparently? Why would Walmart buy it?
What's that true? That like China still has access to the data if they have 80% of the company. What is that really?
Yeah, I don't know.
It's so American, too.
I'm guessing it's all for show. That's the only thing I can think of.
I can't imagine doing anything else. like, nothing really changes when you own 20%.
Yeah, like they had the argument was like the Chinese government like basically had control of the company.
Yeah.
And they said, well, no, we have an American CEO. And then something happened, they fired the American CEO. So that was like the proof that like the Chinese government now was like, in charge of it. But now Walmart and Oracle owns 20%. So now they no longer have access to our data.
Yeah.
Or is it that now because they have some American ownership, now they're subject to some sort of US regulation?
So they still have 80%
I think
ownership.
it's now under US copyright law.
Okay, so that'll make it
They still have-
harder in theory for them to
they
steal
still have
it.
80% of the profit. That's like not even close.
Yeah, plus they're gonna have like all the workers running the company over there. Like that doesn't change that.
I think it was mostly political.
Everything's just for show. Just got news that Saquon Barkley's out for the season.
So is Christian McCaffrey.
I thought he was just out a couple
No,
weeks.
4 or 5 games, but for me, that's a big deal. I have him on fantasy.
Oh, yeah.
And my team is dead now. Yeah, for 5 weeks. I have him on my fantasy team, and I haven't set him. It sucks.
Hope you have his backup. Well, at least the Giants get a good draft pick this year. All right. Let's start on looking at government intervention into the market. We're obviously not going to get through this today. We'll talk about price floors, price ceilings, and prohibition. So now for economic efficiency, we said that that society is better off overall. We haven't said that each and every individual is as well off as they can be. So the total net benefit. So all of society might be maximized at equilibrium, but individuals can always make themselves better off. However, once we reach that equilibrium, they can only make themselves better off by harming other people. So they make people worse off, they make themselves better off, but society is still the same. So imagine if I robbed one of you guys, I took one of your laptops. I'm now better off. You're now worse off. Society is no better off. Now in markets, sellers would typically prefer a higher price. Consumers would prefer to pay a lower price. But normally, that's not the case. At equilibrium, you have to pay that price or not participate in the market. So if you value it greater than that price, you're going to buy it. If you don't value it as much as the market price, you won't buy it. But through the process of government, through different laws and regulations, groups of people can escape equilibrium and make themselves better off. But this will be at the expense of someone else. So one option is price controls. So there's two main types of price controls. The first is a price ceiling, the other is a price floor. Price ceiling is legally determined maximum price a sellers can charge. So basically saying you cannot charge more than this price. The price floor, the opposite, legally determined minimum price that sellers may receive. In the United States, we don't have many price floors and price ceilings. Typically, we allow market prices to be determined through transactions. But there are a few examples, things like minimum wage, rent controls, and agricultural price controls. These are in small sectors of the economy. They don't affect too many people, but they are there and they do have an effect in these markets. So first we'll look at price floors. This legally determined minimum price that sellers can receive. Now this provides protection for producers. They know that they'll make at least a certain amount back. They'll gain a certain amount of revenue from selling their product, but this benefit comes at the consumer's expense. So consumers are now forced to pay higher prices. The economy has the same amount of producer and consumer surplus as it did before, but who has the consumer surplus, or how much consumer surplus there is and how much producer surplus there is different. So that changes. In this case, producers get some of the consumer surplus that there would be in a competitive market equilibrium. So one example is the market for wheat. Price floors in agricultural markets go back to the Great Depression. The Great Depression, farmers were hit particularly hard by the collapse in demand. They couldn't get the money back. They couldn't get enough money back from selling the crops they grew for like the cost of planting. So this was a serious, serious problem. It didn't help that most of the communities the farmer lived, it was pretty much all farming in that area. So when all the farmers struggle, banks fail because that's the only people they're loaning money to. None of them can pay back. It destroyed communities. So the government stepped in and instituted a price floor. Said you cannot sell below this certain price, which helped the farmers. But we'll see a reduced consumer surplus. So let's say in this example, the equilibrium price for wheat is $6.50. The equilibrium quantity is going to be 2 billion bushels. So let's say wheat farmers convince the government to impose a price floor of $8. So it's going to be above equilibrium. Your price floors will always be above equilibrium because if they were below, then it wouldn't have an effect. You put the price floor down here at say $5. Well, the market price is $6.50, so that's what it's going to be sold at. So previously, this little triangle up here, A and B were consumer surplus. This shape here and C were producer surplus. A is going to be transferred. This consumer surplus goes to producer surplus, selling at this new price of $8. The quantity demanded by consumers is going to fall to 1.8 billion. Right here where that $8 price crosses the demand curve. And we'll end up with a dead weight loss in triangles B and C between the new quantity being sold in the market and the equilibrium quantity that would have been sold in the market. So these 200 million bushels of wheat that would have been traded in equilibrium but are not traded now, that represents the dead weight loss. So these transactions that could have taken place if we were in competitive equilibrium. But now at $8 a bushel, go over to where that $8 crosses the supply curve. Farmers will be willing to produce 2.2 billion bushels per week. We'll end up with a surplus because if they get $8 per bushel of wheat, they'll be willing to produce up until the marginal cost equals $8. So we end up with a surplus of wheat on the market. They don't realize they won't be able to sell all their wheat, so they produce the 2.2 billion bushels where they're up to their marginal cost. So there's a few solutions that governments can do to deal with this surplus. Because if you just let this surplus on the market and you have a price floor, what happens is because they can't lower the price, they can't move it back towards equilibrium. So farmers will just have unsold wheat. In this case, 400 million bushels of unsold wheat. Those farmers that can't sell that wheat, they're now getting $0 back for that. So they won't be able to operate continually at this sort of loss. One thing the government can do is straight up buy the wheat. They can pay the wheat farmers to leave a portion of their fields fallow, like unplanted. So that way there's not too much being brought to the market. Another thing the government can do, which they did in the Great Depression, was buy the wheat and then destroy it. So while people were standing in like bread lines, like barely able to afford food, they were also paying and destroying food because they couldn't get it distributed to people that need it. So only thing they could do, that they could afford to do, was destroy it. Back in '96, they wanted to phase this out, these price floors. So they said what they'll do is they'll give farmers a subsidy to kind of make up. They're right here, they're giving everyone $8 per bushel, all the farmers. On the market, they get $6.50. So they say, okay, we'll give them the subsidy So it'll be as if they're still selling it for $8 a bushel. And that was supposed to phase out the price floor. But once you start giving someone a subsidy, you can imagine what happens. They want to keep it. So today we still have the subsidy going on, being given to farmers, and we still have the price floors. Yeah, there's a couple minutes left. So we'll begin next class talking about minimum wage.